Welcome back to the Scarab Solutions Ancient Art Podcast. I'm your host, Lucas Livingston, your guide on our journey across the ancient Mediterranean world. Last time in episode 11, the Parthenon Frieze Part 2, we continued to inch toward our understanding of the Persian influence on the Parthenon frieze. We discovered that Ionian Greek artisans played a significant role in the construction of the Persian imperial cities at Persepolis and Susa. We also looked at further evidence for the employment of Ionian artists in the ancient Near East, in particular Asia Minor, like at Xanthos in Lycia. So in this cultural melting pot of the Persian Empire, we see a significant exchange of artistic, iconographic, and social ideas, some of which shape Persian and Near Eastern art, while other ideas make their way over from Persia to Greece. In this episode, we'll begin with a brief history of the Ionic frieze before diving headlong into the Persian influences on the Parthenon frieze of the Athenian Acropolis. It's not absolutely necessary to trace the history of the Ionic frieze, but since the Parthenon frieze participates in this history, it's important to isolate what's traditional and what's new and innovative, so we can more easily identify the various influences. The early Ionic frieze was basically just a continuous decorative band running around the perimeter of sacred structures like temples, shrines, and sanctuaries. It's called the Ionic frieze because it develops in Ionia, which we learned last time means the Greek nations along the western coast of what's now Turkey. You typically see animals and human figures on the Ionic frieze engaging in hunting, horse and chariot races, feasting, and ritual processions or parades, but there's really no attempt at representing specific identifiable stories, not at this early stage. Also, there's seldom a clear beginning, middle, or end to the scene, and we see a strong sense of repetition among the figures, creating a sense of rhythm as one passes by. As we'll see more closely later on, many of the subjects and themes are also found on the Parthenon frieze, coming together under a grand artistic and civic vision. While the early Ionic frieze had a largely decorative function with little mythological or historical narrative context, there seems to have been a change towards the end of the Archaic period as the Ionic frieze regularly begins to depict mythological stories. One of the earliest examples of this transformation is seen on the treasury of the Sifnians at Delphi from around 530 to 525 BC. The Sifnian treasury was a small sacred structure, like a chapel or shrine, dedicated to the god Apollo. It was built by the island city-state of Sifnos in the Aegean among the Cycladic islands. It's called a treasury because it's where many devotional offerings dedicated to Apollo were housed, mostly statuary given by the people of Sifnos. This was a common practice by Greek city-states, especially at the sanctuaries of Apollo at Delphi and Zeus at Olympia. Dedicating a treasury was a form of national marketing, so other city-states could gawk at its lavish splendor and be jealous of your wealth and power. The east facade of the frieze on the front of the treasury is divided into two panels of equal length. We see an assembly of the Olympian gods to the left of center and a battle scene from the Trojan War to the right. The organization of the figures is very balanced and thoroughly planned. Even though the left and right panels are architecturally one single unit, they are perceived of as being separate. For one, they represent different narratives. They also, quite literally, have their backs to one another. Also, notice how within each of the two panels, the figures change directions. This helps create a sense of momentum in the figures and draws the attention of the viewer to the center of each panel, where just beneath stood the caryatid columns, which we see here in a beautiful reconstruction of the Sifnian treasury at the Delphi Museum. Unfortunately, the original center of the Olympian panel is now lost, but in the Trojan War scene we see what's thought to be the lifeless body of Sarpedon lying in a crumpled pile, over which the warriors are contesting. So we see two interesting changes in the Ionic frieze taking place on the Sifnian treasury. First, there's the introduction of narrative or stories, no longer just a repetitive meander of galloping horses and flittering birds. Second, further abandoning the traditional repetitive ornamental meander that stretched the entire span of the architrave, we see that the frieze is broken up into different segments with different stories and even subplots as groups of 3 or 4 figures interact more closely with each other. These innovations, the introduction of narrative and breaking up the frieze into isolated segments, directly carry over to the Parthenon frieze. If you're looking for more nitty-gritty details on the Sifnian treasury, check out the article Notes on the Development of the Greek Frieze and other publications by one of the modern pioneers of Greek art history, Brunhilde Sismondo Ridgway. Also check out Richard Neer's article Framing the Gift, the Politics of the Sifnian Treasury at Delphi in Classical Antiquity. You can find these references in the bibliography of the Additional Resources section at scarabsolutions.com. We see another transformation to the Ionic frieze taking place in the classical period directly on the Parthenon frieze itself. For the first time in the history of the Ionic frieze, an immediately contemporary ritual practice is alluded to or directly represented, what you might call the history of the now. As I briefly mentioned towards the beginning of the episode, the traditional Ionic frieze could represent ritual processions and cavalcades of horses. Here on the Parthenon frieze, however, we see the Athenians representing not anonymous figures or mythical characters, but themselves, sort of a civic self-portrait of the Athenians high above their heads as they parade alongside below in ritual procession. A brief side note, some of the images used here are modern replicas of the Parthenon frieze. You'll find these replicas of the original frieze decorating the front entrance to the Art Institute of Chicago on Michigan Avenue, and also on the north and south sides. You'll also find them inside the Art Institute, high above the grand staircase, in the large daylit atrium, officially known as Gallery 200. These replicas look back to the early tradition and origin of the Art Institute as an art school rather than an art museum. The galleries were once filled with plaster casts of great classical and Renaissance sculpture to serve as models and teaching aids for the art students. But over the past century, the Art Institute's gotten rid of nearly all examples to make room for original works of art from throughout the world. One fun little thing I like to point out can be seen on the north side of the building. Here, high above your head, you'll see not only a replica of a portion of the east frieze of the Parthenon, although the figures on the Art Institute aren't actually in the same order as the current generally accepted reconstruction, but you'll also see 2 of the 3 pivotal artists involved in the construction of the Parthenon. We have Phidias, sculptor of the frieze and overall designer of the classical Acropolis, and Ictinus, architect of the classical Parthenon itself. Not present here is Callicrates, co-architect with Ictinus. Instead, we have Praxiteles, famed Hellenistic sculptor of many well-known works, including the Aphrodite of Cnidos, of which you'll find a Roman period copy within the Art Institute. Perhaps we'll take a closer look at this fabulous statue in a later episode of the podcast.